I watched them as they entered my office. A very attractive couple. However, both looked unhappy, because happy couples do not come to a marriage counselor. But I was watching their body language closely, looking for clues about the specifics of their problems. They settled into two identical chairs opposite my desk, and we began to get to know each other. Welcome. I'm Dr. Tom Everett. You can call me Tom. After exchanging glances, the wife spoke first. I'm Leanne Seidler. She fell silent, and after a moment her husband said, "And I'm Mark Gleason." "Nice to meet you both," I said, and stood up again to shake hands with both of you. Then there was silence for a few moments. Leanne is an amazing woman, probably 6'3", with shoulder-length wavy black hair and dark expressive eyes. She is dressed in a sweater thick enough to emphasize her noticeable breasts, and her legs are also slender. They are clearly visible in a relatively short skirt. I wouldn't say that Leanne is beautiful, not in the sense of a model, but she is very attractive and radiates sensuality. However, beyond that, she seemed upset and defensive. The way she carried herself, sitting in my office, seemed closed and wary. Does she feel guilty or angry? Or both? I couldn't tell. Mark is a very handsome man, 1 meter 88 tall. He has reddish hair and blue eyes, as well as a rough appearance, which, it seemed to me, attracts a lot of female attention to him. He also has a strong, willed chin and an athletic physique. I wondered if he had played linebacker in college. However, unlike Leanne, his sadness manifested itself in a humble, somewhat defeated look. He was slouching, which was in marked contrast to Leanne's tense posture. "Well," I said after a few minutes, "first let me ask you a couple of questions, if you don't mind. Mark, what do you do, and how long have you been married to Leanne?" "I am an architect, but also a builder. It's quite difficult. First I got an engineering degree, then I worked for a while on a construction site, building houses. About 10 years ago, I returned to college to get an architectural degree, and now I design houses, but I still do construction." He spoke without much energy, as if his answers didn't really matter. "Leanne and I have been married for a little less than 4 years. This is a second marriage for each of us. I was married to a woman for only a couple of years, right after college, but it turned out that we didn't have much in common." He paused, and I turned to Leanne. "Leanne, do you work too?" She gave me a smile that would have been attractive if it hadn't been so intense. "Yes, I am a real estate agent at Century 21. I am engaged in residential real estate in Evanston and Winnetka, where we live." Then silence again. These first meetings with couples usually take place in one of two ways. Sometimes a husband and wife can't wait to tell their stories, and I have to slow them down so they don't interrupt each other or yell at each other. And sometimes it's different, as in the case of Mark and Leanne. No one wants to talk about why they're here, and I have to get it out of them. "Okay," I said. "As you know, I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I have a lot of marriage counseling in my practice." He received his doctorate from Northwestern University and has been practicing here in Chicago for about 15 years. "I'll be happy to tell you about my biography if you want, but why don't we move on to why you came to me? How can I help you?" Mark and Leanne stared at each other in awkward tension. No one seemed to want to talk. Finally, Mark said, "We have problems in our marriage. Intimacy. I had difficulties with the execution." He stared at the carpet in front of my desk. "I've been sleeping in the guest room lately. It's just that sometimes it seems to me that it's too difficult to be with." He waved his hand vaguely in Leanne's direction, but did not finish the sentence. I looked at Leanne and saw that her tension had increased. "Has this been a problem throughout your marriage, or has it started to happen recently?" I spoke as if nothing had happened, trying to give the impression that we were talking about something frivolous. He looked up at me. "Quite recently. About 6 or 7 weeks ago." I caught. He stopped, coughed, and continued. "I returned home from a trip ahead of time and saw my wife with another man." Leanne practically jumped out of her chair. "We have an agreement. Mark and me. He knows that I sometimes date other men." Keeping my expression neutral, I nodded to Leanne and looked back at Mark. He looked even more pained, but nodded his head in agreement. "Yes, even before the wedding, we agreed that Leanne could, but we've always been very careful. I've never seen it or heard of it." Leanne cut in again. "It was like Don't ask and you won't get an answer. I knew Mark didn't want to know anything about it, so I made sure it didn't overlap with our married life at all. I looked at Mark again to make sure that this was his view of it. With some reluctance, he nodded his head. She was very good at keeping her other activities a secret. I never knew anything about the details. Until that day, I waited for one of them to continue, but again there was silence. Mark looked deeply withdrawn, and Leanne was practically seething with tension. And since then it has become difficult? I asked. Mark just looked at me and nodded, clearly not wanting to say anything more. Leanne flushed. I did everything I could. I like making love to Mark and I. She stopped for a moment, looking at her husband. I encouraged him. I was patient. But sometimes it seems that Mark doesn't even want. That's not true. Mark suddenly came to life, showing energy for the first time since he entered my office. Actually, I love Leanne and I. He stopped, and the energy seemed to leave him again. I just still see them, and it just takes away my self-confidence, I think. Tears welled up in Leanne's eyes. She reached out to take Mark's hand, but he reluctantly extended his own to her. After a minute or so, she let her go. Although I prefer to work together with both halves of the couple, it has already become clear that this will not work in this case. There are deep feelings on both sides, in which neither Mark nor Leanne feel comfortable just expressing them in front of each other. Okay, I said with what I hoped was an encouraging smile. I think it would be better if I talked to each of you alone first before we meet again. I spoke confidently, as if I constantly resort to this procedure. Can each of you schedule 2-hour-long meetings with me this week and 2 more next week? After some hesitation, they both nodded, Leanne more readily than her husband, and we agreed on the details regarding dates and times. When they left my office, I studied their body language again. Leanne briefly reached out to Mark to hug him, but he didn't respond. When they reached the door of my office, he held the door for her, but casually, without much tenderness and attention. Obviously, things are not going well. I was glad that Mark and Leanne had reached out to me, but I wasn't at all sure that I could help them rebuild their relationship. The story of Mark Gleason. In our separate meetings without Leanne, it was much easier to get Mark to talk. He was still unhappy and dejected, but his body language and energy levels were less depressed. I was glad to see that he trusted me enough to tell his story with a reasonable degree of candor. I could also see in him the features of a strong, healthy, and strong man who must have attracted Leanne from the very beginning. Mark grew up in Ohio, the eldest son of a carpenter and a schoolteacher. He was always tall, athletic, and handsome, and was something of a golden boy. In his last 2 years of high school, he became a state champion as a linebacker in lacrosse and went on to play lacrosse at Miami University in Ohio, where he was the best player in his sport for 3 years. He was a good student, but not an outstanding one, graduating from the university with a degree in engineering with an average grade of B, 80 to 89%. He worked part-time at a construction site in the summer. So when he moved to Chicago after graduating from university, it was not difficult for him to find a good job in a house-building company. The combination of practical experience and engineering training soon brought him to the attention of the chief architect. After 6 years at the company, Mark went back to college to get an architect's degree and then returned to work as an architect and construction supervisor. Such a mixture of intellectual and physical work suited him and allowed him to keep himself in amazing shape. What about his romantic and sexual life? It seemed that I always seemed attractive to girls, even in high school. It also helped that I was a lacrosse star, but girls were always dying to go out with me, even the sweetest cheerleaders. I lost my virginity in junior high school with Ellie Harmon. She was my girlfriend for about a year, and we often made love. When we broke up, in the middle of my senior year, I became a free player. By the time I graduated from high school, I had probably slept with a dozen other girls. It was pretty much the same in college. Sometimes I was in a relationship, sometimes I just went on dates. But there were always women who wanted to make love to me, and I gladly agreed. I wasn't a Don Juan, and I certainly didn't set out to seduce and dump girls. But I loved girls, as well as making love. And if they wanted to go to bed with me, I was ready, wanted, and longed. In his senior year, Mark fell in love with Catherine Kubek, his classmate, and immediately after graduating from high school, they got married. The marriage lasted less than 2 years, but Mark doesn't regret it much. Probably, we just didn't have much in common when the excitement and passion subsided. We didn't even fight much, we just drifted apart. The divorce was amicable, no hard feelings. She got married again and moved to California, I think, not far from San Jose. It was all quite a long time ago. At the age of 25, Mark became a bachelor again and enjoyed playing on the field in the big city of Chicago for several years. As before, there were many interested women. Some turned into girlfriends, others were just short affairs. Then he stopped and looked at me. Actually, it's ironic. I've always been successful with women. I've always felt confident and in control of myself in bed, sexually. It's not that I'm any kind of master in the art of bedding, but the women I've made love to have always acted like everything was great, and so I've never been bothered if I'm a good lover. I just assumed that it was so. But now, because of this story with Leanne, that's probably the hardest part. I've been confident all my life, and now it seems like it's gone forever. Tell me about how you and Leanne got together. When he spoke about his wife and their first days together, energy and enthusiasm returned to his voice. It was clear that he was remembering happier times than the ones he was going through now. Unsurprisingly, they met because she was marketing some of the houses built by his company. The first time they went out for a drink after work, Mark felt a spark between them. She wasn't the most beautiful woman I've ever met, although she's very beautiful. But she has so much energy. Leanne is so full of life. Her laughter, her gestures, the way she flirts. He laughed a little bitterly. She flirts a lot. She's always flirted. And it didn't bother me at all at the time. I was confident in myself, as I said before, and it was quite exciting to be around a woman who flaunts her attractiveness a little. It has never been excessive. I never felt like she was flirting with other guys or asking for dates while we were together. She just knew she was beautiful, knew men wanted her, and didn't mind them seeing that she knew about it. Mark said he probably could have gotten her into bed after their first date, but held back. He already had a feeling that Leanne was special, and he didn't want to rush things. On their second date, Friday night, he cooked dinner for her at his apartment. I did my best. I'm a pretty good cook, and I really wanted to impress her. So I cooked some great dishes, took a bottle of good wine. Well, you know what I mean. The date ended with a sit-down by the fireplace, and then a night of lovemaking in Mark's bed. Leanne stayed with him the next day and night, going home only to change her clothes. According to him, almost immediately they seemed to have a stormy romance. I was just crazy about her. Not only in intimacy, but also talking to her, just holding her hand. We did typical things for lovers, for example. We wandered through antique shops or sat in the park on a picnic. She was smart, funny, so beautiful and infinitely interesting. According to Mark, from the very beginning, their bed life was amazing. Leanne was obviously experienced, which didn't bother him at all because he had experience too, and she was passionate and skilled. They made love tenderly for a long time, and at other times satisfied each other until they lost consciousness. Both enjoyed oral love, either as foreplay or sometimes instead of intercourse. And Leanne was ready for anything Mark wanted to try. Unusual poses, making love outdoors in a local park. Once she even sat on his lap in an adult cinema, and dirty old men in raincoats looked at it with envy. For several months, they saw each other 2 or 3 times a week. We always spent at least one day and night of the weekend together, sometimes in her apartment, then in his. But when one day Mark offered to live together, Leanne said she wasn't ready yet, and he backed off. However, I knew that she was made for me. I was 34, had been single for 9 years, and was ready to settle down with this incredible woman forever. After 8 months of dating, one summer day, Mark invited Leanne to a picnic in a park on the shores of Lake Michigan. After a leisurely lunch together in the shade on the bedspread, he took out an engagement ring and proposed to her. She reacted so strangely. She looked at me in surprise, then smiled, kissed me hard, and then cried. Several times she said, "Oh, Mark, I love you," but did not say yes. And then, still crying, she said, "Let's go back to my apartment right now. I need you, honey, and I don't want to wait another minute." They returned to her apartment, and she made love to Mark with an intensity and tenderness beyond anything he had ever experienced. According to him, it was the most complete satisfaction, physical and emotional, that he had ever experienced. I've never felt so close to her, to anyone. I've never felt so completely loved. We fell asleep in each other's arms for a while. I think it was the happiest moment of my life. Everything seemed perfect, although I vaguely remembered that she still hadn't agreed to marry me. When they woke up, they took a shower together, and Mark reminded Leanne of his offer with a smile. To his surprise, she looked serious and said they needed to talk. They dried off, got dressed, and she led him to the couch. "Mark," she said, "this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my entire life. Please listen to me before you say anything, okay? God, I'm so afraid that you'll just get up and walk out of my life. I love you, completely and completely, and I want to marry you so much. But first you have to find out something about me. And after you find out, I do not know if you will ever want to see me again." I had no idea what she was going to say and protested that nothing would change my feelings for her, but she interrupted me. "Listen to me first, okay? I, God, I don't know how to say this. All my life I've needed variety, different men, in proximity. I realized a long time ago that absolute attractive monogamy, it doesn't suit me. I've never cheated on anyone in my life, but when I try to be faithful to one man, my high school boyfriend, and then Adam, her first husband, I just realized that I couldn't be happy that way." I looked at her in complete amazement, Mark continued. "I wondered if she slept with other guys while we were dating, and I started to get furious, but then I realized that we had never discussed this. I never asked her to be exclusive with me or said that I was exclusive with her, although I was. After our second date, I didn't even think about another woman. It turned out that Leanne was dating, in her own words, sleeping with other guys while we were having an affair. She talked about it very vaguely, no figures, no specifics. It was clear that all this was solely for the sake of making love, for the thrill of doing it with someone new. In the 8 months that we were together, there were clearly more than one of them, but I don't know how many. 5, 10, 40? I had no idea. She didn't speak, and I realized almost immediately that I didn't want to know. Leanne saw that I was stunned, and it hurt. She repeated over and over how much she loved me, that she had never felt such deep feelings for anyone before. Over and over again, she explained that her contacts with other men were fun and exciting, but superficial. They had nothing to do with her emotional life, although they obviously satisfied some important needs of hers. Probably the need for arousal or the need to feel attractive. I think she'll tell you about it herself. In general, she assured me that she would love to spend the rest of her life with me, but she needs freedom to continue sleeping with other guys. Only from time to time, baby, she told me. Never anything permanent, no love affairs, nothing serious. I sat in silence, stunned. Do you understand? He probably looked at her as if she had two heads, and she was crying softly, holding my hand and constantly telling me how much she loved me. "I will be absolutely careful, as I have been so far, darling. There will be no one from our mutual acquaintances, no one from work, just something personal and separate from our life together. And you'll never know anything about it. You won't even think about it unless you want to." Finally, she ran out of words, and we sat in silence. She looked affectionate and incredibly excited, and I looked as if a piano had fallen on my head. When I pulled myself together to speak, I probably sounded pretty stupid. I said something like, "So you've been dating other guys since we were together?" She nodded and said, "Yes, baby. But you didn't know anything, did you? And have you ever felt the slightest uncertainty about my love or how much I want you? God, you should know how you drive me crazy in bed." And she leaned over and hugged me tightly, kissing my cheek and neck. I was still in shock and said, "And do you want me to let you sleep with other men after we get married?" She just looked at me sadly and then nodded. "I just can't be completely faithful, Mark. I know myself well enough to know that I can't be happy that way. But you'll never know. I will never, ever do anything to embarrass you. I swear. It will be exclusively when we are not together, and when we are, you will have all of me. Just like I've been with you every minute we've been together, since that very first night when you cooked dinner for me. I knew I had to leave. I suddenly felt like I was in the middle of a nightmare and couldn't wake up. I told Leanne that I needed to think about it and that I would contact her. She tried to persuade me to stay to talk about it, but I just gave her a quick kiss and got out of there. I was in complete shock. Unsurprisingly, Leanne's revelation completely unsettled Mark. It took several days before he could bring himself to call her, although she left him a few affectionate and worried messages. He could hardly concentrate on his work when thoughts were racing through his head. And one thought was on top of all of them. Was I really that wrong about Leanne? Was I completely blind to what kind of person she was? The debauched lifestyle that Leanne insisted on continuing completely contradicted everything he knew about her. She was loving, attentive, caring, and devoted to him. Mark just couldn't put these contradictory pieces together, and it was driving him crazy. Finally, almost a week later, he called Leanne and they met for lunch. My heart jumped at the sight of her when I hugged her. She was so beautiful, and I realized once again how much I love her. While we were waiting for the food to be brought to us, she took my hand across the table and said, "I've missed you so much, Mark." Before I could stop myself, I said, "How much?" and fell silent. I wanted to ask, "How many guys have you slept with in the last week?" The question was almost on my lips, but I stopped. I realized that I didn't want to know. I apologized, went to the toilet, washed my face, tried to calm down, and then returned to the table, and we talked about something else. After they ate, Mark told her how much he disliked her insistence on being with other men. Frankly, it angered and scared me. He told me, "I have always been a confident lover, and now I was tormented by doubts that I would not be able to satisfy the woman I love. I'm obviously not enough for her, otherwise why would she sleep with others?" All Leanne could do was calm him down, over and over again. According to her, he has nothing to do with it. He is a fantastic lover, and she is completely satisfied with him, both in bed and out of it. It's about her own needs, something exciting, spontaneous, and completely separate from their relationship. And she asked Mark if they could just keep seeing each other, take a small step back, go back to dating, spend nights together sometimes and see how things go. She said she was sure he would understand how much she cared about him and that her other activities did not threaten their relationship. "Please don't give up on me, baby," she said. As crazy as it may seem, I decided to give it a chance. All week I've been thinking about how much I love Leanne, more than any woman I've ever known, and I couldn't imagine not being with her. So I said to myself, what am I missing? One of Mark's basic rules about Leanne was that they wouldn't talk about her relationships with other men anymore. He didn't want to know anything about it at all and expected her to keep her activities a complete secret from him. I know that I have always been able to deny unpleasant things, push them away, and pretend that they do not exist. I probably got it from my father, who was the same. In my first year of college, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, from which she died a year and a half later. I still remember all those doctors' meetings with me, my father and my sister. The doctor spoke in detail about my mother's condition and her prognosis. And when the three of us discussed it afterwards, it was as if my father and I were not in the room. My sister said, "Don't you remember? The doctor said she only had 3 months to live," or something like that, and my father and I shook our heads. I guess we both just needed to protect ourselves emotionally, and we did it by suppressing everything painful. And I did the same thing with Leanne's affairs. I guess I can call them that. Probably, another man in the same situation would want to discuss everything. Establish all sorts of rules with Leanne, for example, no more than so many affairs per month, or never in our house, or always use elastic bands. But I just didn't want to know anything. I wanted to close my eyes and stick my fingers in my ears. Actually, I knew about the rubber bands because Leanne always insisted on them. When we decided to stop using them together, it became very important. When things got serious between us, she started taking pills. We went and got tested for sexually transmitted diseases, and when we both turned out to be clean, we celebrated by making love without a rubber band for the first time. So I knew without question that she was probably using rubber bands with other guys. However, if not, I insisted that this topic be forgotten and not brought up again. And Leanne readily agreed. She wanted to please me so much, She was ready to do anything to get us together, so we just didn't bring it up. Actually, he recalled, that's not quite true. I touched on this topic again, about a week later. I asked if I didn't make love to her often enough, and if that was the reason she needed other guys. And she looked at me lovingly, a little sadly, and said no, it had nothing to do with the case. She liked our relationship the way it is. It's like needing a massage, she said, or playing a vigorous game of racquetball. It's just a physical release that has nothing to do with love, nothing to do with how we feel about each other. I can't say that this answer satisfied me, but there was nothing left but to leave everything as it is. After that conversation at lunch, Mark and Leanne's relationship gradually improved. They took their time, limiting themselves to one date a week or two for a while. At first, Mark wasn't sure that he would immediately want to continue making love to her, perhaps because of resentment and self-doubt. Every time they were together, he couldn't help but wonder who else she might have slept with since the last time he saw her, what they might have done to her. Did they excite her more than he did? But Leanne was too loving and beautiful to resist for long. And when they were back in bed, their lovemaking was as passionate and satisfying as ever. Somewhat to Mark's disbelief, a few months later he discovered that his relationship with Leanne was as good as ever. As I said before, I can't deny everything, and I have a lot of experience. It's not that I've forgotten what Leanne could do when we weren't together. In fact, at first I thought about it all the time, every day when we were apart. Is she sleeping with someone right now? Where did she meet him? Isn't he better than me? Does he give her pleasure that I can never match? But I resolutely pushed these thoughts away, and after a while there were not so many of them. And Leanne has never done the slightest thing that would make me jealous or suspicious. She could sleep with other guys once a month or 3 times a week, and I had no idea. What about your own contact life? Was Leanne available to you when you wanted to make love? Did she initiate lovemaking with you? Yes, both. Both then, and since we got married, we had a lot of lovemaking, and the initiative belonged to one of us. She probably said sometimes that she was too tired or just didn't want to, but that didn't happen often, and there was never anything about it that could make me suspicious. I sometimes have evenings too when I don't feel that attractive, so I can understand that. 10 months after Leanne told Mark about her affairs, he proposed to her again, and this time she gladly accepted him. I knew I had to let her know that I understood what I was agreeing to, but I just didn't want to talk about it. So I said something like, I love you, and I like the relationship we have now, and I want it to continue the way it is now for the rest of our lives. That's how Leanne understood that I agreed that she could have affairs, and I didn't need to explain it to her. And their marriage was happy and fulfilling for both of them. Right up to the moment when he saw her with another man. They decided not to have children. Leanne continued to take pills, and when they weren't working, they cooked together, met with friends, or traveled. Skiing in winter and sailing in the Caribbean in summer. I must say, Tom, I loved her more and more. My father has turned into a decrepit old man, with whom I and most other people find it difficult to get along. But when he comes to visit, Leanne turns him into an affectionate kitten. She flirts with him, and he flirts back. He becomes absolutely charming. She always takes me aside and tells me how lucky I am to have her. And thanks to their wonderful relationship, Dad and I are now closer than we were many years ago. And when it comes to my friends and colleagues at work, Leanne is just wonderful. At first, I was afraid that she would flirt too much, a little inappropriate. But she completely hides her beautiful side. She is perfectly comfortable being a devoted, supportive wife, and all my friends are saying again how lucky I am. And it's not that she's putting on a show with my dad or my work friends. She is really warm, caring, and knows how to make people feel at ease. And we have such a great time together. I mean, without getting out of bed. I can see by your ring finger that you're married, so I'm sure you know what I mean. After a while, marriage becomes something more than making love. It's communication. The feeling that you have a loving friend who supports you and understands. Stupid get-togethers, watching a stupid movie, going grocery shopping. Suddenly Mark stopped talking and covered his eyes with his hand. Then, without looking at me, he spoke hesitantly again. What did I do wrong? I just love her very much. I can't imagine myself without her, but I also can't. I just don't understand how I can live with what she's doing. We sat in silence for a while, And then I asked him if he would tell me about the day he found her with another man. He nodded, but sat for almost a minute before starting. I flew to Milwaukee for 2 days to supervise a project we were working on there. I've made this trip 4 or 5 times in the last year. I was supposed to return on Thursday at lunchtime, but on the second day we finished work early, and when I arrived at the airport around noon, I managed to get an empty seat on a flight returning to Chicago at 1:45. I barely got on the plane before the doors closed, so I didn't have time to call Leanne before we took off. When we landed in O'Hare, I called her on her cell phone and left a text message that I would be home by 1500 hours. Then, just in case, I called home, but she didn't answer, and I left a voice message there too. Have you thought about the possibility that she might be with someone? I asked. No, I don't know. Maybe. At least a little bit. I would like to say that after 4 years I stopped thinking about it, but that's nonsense. I've never stopped thinking about it. I just started thinking about it less often. It became easier for me to drive these thoughts away from myself. Because, as I said before, Leanne never did or said anything that would arouse the slightest suspicion in me. No late returns home in rumpled clothes. No running past me into the shower. No phone calls to the house with throwing the receiver when I answered. Nothing like that. It was like I was married to the most perfect, most faithful wife in the world. But I knew that wasn't the case. So, yes, I probably thought about that possibility. I don't know how seriously it bothered me, but anyway, when I pulled up to the house, there was an unfamiliar car in the driveway. That's when I really got worried. I sat there for a minute, not knowing what to do. I called the house again from my cell phone, but Leanne didn't answer the phone. I wondered if her friend had stopped by, and if they had gone somewhere in Leanne's car. I guess I hoped that was exactly what happened. I called her cell phone again and got no response. So I walked slowly to the front door, hoping she wasn't sitting inside with some guy. I really didn't want to get involved in something like this. At the same time, I'll be damned if I'm going to sit and wait outside my own house. As I approached the house, I heard sounds from the backyard, where the pool is located. Our house is located in a very secluded location, with a long driveway going deep into the forest and a view of the lake from the backyard. And the day was very hot and sunny. Anyway, I heard a man's voice saying something like, "Oh, baby, this is so good." And Mark stopped, made a face, looked down and folded his arms across his chest, as if trying not to fall apart. I waited in silence. "I know I shouldn't have gone there," he finally said. "I should have turned around immediately, got back in the car and left. I would have had to face Leanne anyway, but it wouldn't have been as bad as seeing it firsthand. But I just couldn't do anything about it." I walked quietly along the path around the house until I saw the pool area. There was Leanne, naked, with a naked guy. He was young, about 28 years old, tall and skinny. Mark was telling this story in a low voice, almost monotonously, his eyes fixed on the carpet in front of him. What killed me was how lovingly everything was. She spread her legs in front of him so gently, as if not with lust, but with love. And while they were making love, slowly and gently, her arms wrapped around his neck, and they kissed, long, deep, with tongue and everything else. All these years, I've dealt with Leanne's affairs, partly by telling myself that her contacts with other men are purely physical, almost like a woman of easy virtue with a client. Just a physical attraction, you know? It's like a tennis match. But it was. He paused for a moment. She and I have made love hundreds of times in the backyard, slowly, enjoying the privacy and each other. And here she was doing the same thing to another. It looked so loving and intimate, just like I imagine when Leanne and I make love. She gave herself completely to this guy. They were muttering to each other, smiling and kissing often. I watched them for a minute or two, I don't know how long. I fell into a stupor and was in incredible pain. And all I could think was, this is making love. She makes love to him, just like she does to me. And of course, it was very obvious to me that this was not the first time with this guy. They were so familiar, so relaxed and loving each other. In the end, I forced myself to pull away. I knew I had to leave there. I was suddenly terrified, and it would just kill me. I didn't even think about breaking into them. It's probably my old instinct of denial. I got back in the car, drove to the mall, and just sat in the car in the parking lot, turning on the air conditioner and playing hard rock as loud as I could. I guess I was trying to turn off my mind or get these images out of my head. Of course, it didn't work. Mark stopped again. He sat staring into space, then finally looked up at me, gave me a half smile that looked more like a grimace, and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I think you should hear the rest, shouldn't you? I smiled silently and nodded, trying to look sympathetic. He nodded back at me and continued, I was absent until 6 o'clock, that is, until the time when I was supposed to return home. I wandered around the mall, looking at women's clothes, CDs, and hardware. I saw a dozen things that I could have bought Leanne as a gift, but I didn't buy anything. It wasn't that I was angry. I was just stunned. It was like a truck had hit me and sent me flying, but I hadn't hit the ground yet. The pain will come soon, but I would like to say that I thought it over and figured out what to do next, but it was just the opposite. Thoughts raced through my head, bringing me back to how they were together, sleeping so lovingly, and I just couldn't forget about it. When I entered the house, Leanne was already waiting for me with a bottle of Sam Adams in her hand. This is our inside joke. She always does this when I come back from a trip, but her face was tense and worried. Of course, she was completely in order, but she checked her answering machine and knew that I had arrived earlier. She had no trouble putting two and two together, and she must have been very worried about what I might see or hear. I think as soon as she saw my face, she immediately realized that things were bad, because she didn't even try to say a cheerful, "Welcome home, darling," or something like that to me. She just looked at me and said, "Oh, Mark, are you all right?" I shook my head, said something like, "Actually, no," and walked past her. Ignoring the beer and her attempt to hug me, went up to the bedroom and closed the door behind me. I wondered if she would come up after me, but she left me alone for a while. I took off my shoes and lay down on the bed, and before I knew it, I burst into tears, sobbed like a child, and what I saw in the afternoon replayed over and over in my head. I couldn't stop. I must have cried for about 20 minutes. In the end, I just fell asleep for an hour or so. When I woke up, I took a shower and went downstairs. Leanne was waiting for me with dinner on the table and looked even more worried than before. I knew I had to tell her something, and I did. "I saw you with him this afternoon." She looked scared and started saying, "Oh, Mark, I'm sorry." But I stopped her by saying, "I don't want to talk about it." I went to the table and held a chair for her, and when she sat down, I took her hand and squeezed it, saying something like, "I'm still here with you," and we had dinner. At first, in complete silence. Every time she tried to talk about that day, I stopped her, just looked at her and put my finger to my lips. It was a rather strange dinner. I think we just ate for about 10 minutes without saying a word. Finally, she asked, "Well, how did it go in Milwaukee?" And I realized that she understood that I just couldn't talk to her about what I saw in the backyard. So I told her about my trip and how the project was progressing. A nice, safe conversation about something else. And then I went into the living room, plopped down on the sofa, and turned on the TV. I have no idea what was shown there, but it didn't really matter. As Mark continued his story, I was more and more amazed at how strong his instinct for denial was. It seemed obvious to me, and probably it would have been obvious to any listener, that the next step was to have a long conversation between him and Leanne, discussing their feelings about what had happened and trying to decide how to move on. But he resisted all attempts by Leanne to start such a conversation and acted as if all he wanted was to get back to normal. Starting the day after his return, Mark did his best to act as if nothing had happened. He was cheerful and affectionate, which must have brought Leanne great relief. But at the same time, he brushed off every hint of her about the events of the previous day. After a couple of days, she seemed to realize that he wanted to pretend that nothing had happened, and agreed with him. The problem, of course, is that it didn't work. And the most obvious place where it didn't work was the bedroom. The following weekend, Mark and Leanne had pre-booked a table at a small hotel in a lakeside town an hour north of Chicago. They had already gone there several times for romantic vacations and always had a great time. We walked along the lake, sunbathed by the pool, and made love a lot. Mark said that in the previous weekends they had made love without a break, maybe 6 times or more in 48 hours. But this time it didn't go according to plan. When Leanne moved closer to Mark in bed on the first night, he was reluctant at first, but nevertheless began to respond to her lovemaking. But in less than a few seconds, he lost his erection. They tried 3 more times over the weekend. Mark tried to avoid the missionary position, but one day he still managed to hold out long enough when Leanne was on top in the cowgirl position, and they achieved, although it was difficult for both of them. As the weekend went on, Mark became more unhappy and withdrawn, and Leanne became more and more anxious. But he still didn't want to talk to her about his feelings. Mark fell silent, and I waited. But it seemed that he didn't want to say anything more. Finally, I asked, "And what has happened since then?" He sighed. "Everything is as before. During the day, we pretend that everything is fine. I know Leanne wants to talk to me about that day, but I just can't get over it. So in the morning we smile and give each other a kiss goodbye, and at dinner we chat about this and that, about plans for the summer or how the work is progressing. The worst thing is in bed. I have the same problems all the time, you know? Leanne is always very patient, loving. She uses her mouth, which sometimes helps for a while, but when we move on to making love, I almost always lose the desire. Increasingly, she doesn't even try. We just snuggle up to each other and fall asleep. One night 2 weeks ago, I dozed off, and then I woke up to hear Leanne sobbing. She turned away and buried her face in the pillow, but I could still hear her. I felt terrible. Since then, I often sleep in the guest room. I stay up late, watch TV or something, until she goes to bed, and then I just go to the guest room, not to our bedroom. I hate doing this, but it's too humiliating to be with Leanne and feel like a total loser. Do you think, I asked cautiously, that it might make sense to talk to Leanne after all? To talk about that day? And what should I say? Mark's eyes were haunted. That I saw her making love to another man very gently, very affectionately? That I couldn't believe how loving she could be with him? That I'm completely destroyed by this? That I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust her again? To believe when she tells me that our love is special? That I'm the only man she really loves? That I can't imagine that I will ever regain my self-confidence? That I'm wondering if I'll ever be able to make love to her the way I used to? Jesus, Tom, what's the point of all this? How can these words make you feel better? Mark was almost shouting, and his hands were gripping the arms of the chair tightly. At least she'll know how you feel, and she will have the opportunity to respond to these feelings, to calm you down. He snorted. That's right. Honey, it wasn't making love. It just looked like it. It doesn't matter that I gave him deep, loving kisses, smiled and whispered in his ear just like I did with you. That's not really what I meant when I talked to him. Do you think this will help? All it will do is confirm to her what a fucking weakling I am, that I am not the man she thought she married. No, I said. I think it will make her understand that the arrangement she insisted on before your wedding, and which you said you could accept, is no longer an arrangement you can live with. He stared at me, his angry expression gradually changing to a more thoughtful one. I continued, "Have you thought about what you want in the future, Mark? For yourself? For your relationship with Leanne? Do you know what you want me to help you and Leanne achieve?" "No, I don't know," he said, slowly shaking his head. "I've been trying to think about it. God, I've been trying to think about this for hours, but my thoughts are just spinning around, leading to nothing. I can't get rid of the images in my head. I know I love Leanne. That hasn't changed. I've never been so happy in my life as I was with her, and I don't want to give it up. But I also know that I can't stand the situation we're in. I just can't stand being one of her constant lovers. Even if I become lover number one, whatever that means. And I don't know if I can. For God's sake, I don't know if I'll ever be the man I was with her before. How can I when I have an image of her and that asshole in the backyard in my head? And if I can't?" He was silent for a full minute. Then he looked up at me. "If I can't become a man with her again, lead a real bed life, then I just can't imagine that we'll stay together. It's going to be a lifetime of hell for both of us." The next time Mark came to my office, his attitude changed dramatically. He entered the office, staggering slightly, and looked relaxed. Sitting down in an armchair, he allowed himself something like a shy smile. When I asked about it, he chuckled. "I'm sorry, Tom. I was thinking about what happened to me at lunch today. I was at a diner on the South Side, just eating a hamburger and drinking coffee on the way here from work, and the waitress tried to pick me up. I looked interested, and he continued, 'She can't be more than 22 or so. Pretty blonde, slim, but with a good figure. She was very attentive, you know? How do you like the hamburger? Can I get you anything else? More coffee? The cherry pie is great today. Would you like a piece? She leaned in a little too far, allowing me to look into the neckline of her blouse. I just kept smiling, enjoying the treatment, and when she brought the check, she smiled at me even wider and winked. When I took it, there was a business card from the restaurant under it. On the back she wrote, "I get off at 6 p.m. and I'm free most of the night. Love, Liz," and left a phone number. Are you tempted to do something? He shook his head. And not seriously. I mean, she's pretty, and I'm sure it would be fun to get into bed with her, but certainly not now that I'm still married to Leanne. He looked sober and thoughtful. Okay, but can you imagine how you will do it? What do you think will happen? Interestingly, his answer was quite confident. He described how he would call Liz, invite her to dinner, and then to bed. Does this happen to you often? I asked. Well, that is, when women try to pick you up like that. Actually, yes, he said, looking slightly embarrassed. Of course, not when I'm with Leanne, but quite often when I'm alone, or sometimes even with some guys from work. With a mixture of pride and embarrassment, Mark continued to tell me many similar stories. Apparently, he was the object of female attention almost everywhere he went, in grocery stores, bars, restaurants, sometimes on the subway. Back when I was a bachelor, I was more than willing to accept the offer of some of these women. I remember 2 girls from Northwestern University flirting with me on the subway. As a result, we went to their apartment and made love almost nonstop from Friday evening to Sunday afternoon. It turned out that they do this from time to time. They are bi, and they really like sharing a guy. When I was temporarily exhausted, they gave each other a 69, and it quickly made me tense up again. When Mark told me about his adventures, the tone of his voice and body language betrayed a relaxation and confidence in him that I hadn't noticed before. Towards the end of the session, he started to slow down, and I asked, "And what comes to your mind, Mark, when you think about the stories that were told today?" After a moment, he replied, "I guess I feel awkward right now, like I'm a big braggart trying to impress you with all the beauties I've satisfied. Like I was trying to convince you that I was some kind of stud. Convince me or remind yourself?" I asked. I don't know, well, maybe both. What strikes me, Mark, is that you told these stories without bragging, quite casually. I think you've remembered that for a huge part of your adult life, you not only attracted women, but you were also a good lover, someone who satisfied them and gave them a lot of pleasure. Why did you want to remind yourself of this right now? That's a pretty obvious question, Doc. He replied sarcastically. Because ever since I saw Leanne with that guy, I feel like a loser. But your stories paint a pretty convincing picture that you are not a loser at all, do you? He nodded slowly. Yes, it probably is. I think. In a way, I was cheering myself up, wasn't I? I nodded. And it is quite understandable that you feel the need for this in light of what you are struggling with. But the fact is obvious, Mark. You are a very attractive guy. Someone who gets along with women without problems, and who makes them happy in bed, including Leanne, from what you've told me. Now we have to stop for a minute, but I want you to think about what we've just come to. What you saw that day in the backyard dealt a blow to your sense of masculinity, and it would be hard for almost any husband to go through. But the blow was not fatal. In the story you just told me, imagining a night out with Liz from a restaurant, you were a confident, successful lover who excited and delighted your partner. You're still like that, Mark. You still feel like you are. He looked at me intently and nodded slightly. Actually, I believe it. To my surprise, I believe it. The only question is, can I still be that guy with Leanne? Or will I have to find someone else to regain that confidence? And before I could answer, he got up and headed for the door, saying only when he was leaving, "Thanks, Tom." The story of Leanne Seidler. From the very beginning, my conversations with Leanne were completely different. She is much less methodical and orderly than her husband, and we tended to jump from one topic to another. Besides, she was clearly unhappy and anxious, and the mixture of guilt and contradiction was obvious from the moment she first came to my office alone. Well, I guess it's time to listen to this woman of easy virtue, right? She stared at me as if she wanted me to agree with her. Actually, I've never found that term so useful, I said. Then what are we going to call me? The The wife who can't keep her legs closed? An evil cuckolding harlot? Is that what you think of yourself, Leanne? I asked. Suddenly she began to cry. No, she said. Maybe so. A little. She wiped her tears with a napkin. I've never been like this. Not before Mark and I got married. Not even before this happened. I was very attractive. I found out about it as a teenager, and it has remained that way ever since. Making love means a lot to me. And the thrill, the excitement of talking to different men, I've always needed it. But I've never felt like a woman of easy virtue before. And what was the reason for this change? The way Mark looks at me. The way he's going through life right now, all crushed and feeling sorry for himself. The fact that he can no longer make love to me, or even be near me. She began to cry softly again, looking at me. After dinner, he locks himself in his office with papers or freezes before a baseball game on TV. And he doesn't go to bed for a long time after I go to bed. Or he kisses me on the cheek and goes to sleep in the guest room. I miss him. I want him to come back, but he won't let me in. Tell me, Tom. Tell me, please. What did I do wrong? We had an agreement, and no one can say that I did not fulfill my part of the deal. I was absolutely careful, absolutely restrained. And then Mark came home early in the afternoon. I didn't hear the phone because I was outside, and everything went to hell. I'm afraid for him, and I'm afraid for my marriage. I'm afraid he'll never come back to me. We sat for a few more minutes while she cried. After a while, I handed her a box of tissues, and she took it without comment. Finally, when she calmed down, I said, I hope I can help. I think I can do it, but I need to know more. Is it okay if we go back to the beginning? As I said, Leanne didn't tell me her story in chronological order, but I got the gist. She was the third in a family of 3 girls and grew up in Minneapolis. Her mother was a housewife, and her father, a history professor at the University of Minnesota, was cold, distant, and demanding. Leanne had never been an excellent student, like her older sister Mary, or a good athlete, like her middle sister Caitlin, and it was always difficult for her to win her father's approval. However, by high school she had become the most beautiful, and she enjoyed her father's belated attention and compliments. Attracting the attention of high school students became a natural extension of attracting her father's attention, only even easier, and she enjoyed it. She learned how to flirt, be beautiful, and not seem cheap at the same time, and boys flocked to her. Despite not being a cheerleader, which was usually required to succeed in society, in junior high school she became the girlfriend of the quarterback of the football team and held on to him until they both graduated from high school. This happened partly because she was a bright, attractive, and charming girl, and partly because she was ready to make love to him. Bradley wasn't a virgin when he took Leanne's virginity, but unlike many athletes, he was a kind, caring boy and actually loved Leanne. He was gentle and patient, so her first experience of sexual intercourse was slightly painful, but not at all frightening, and she gladly continued to make love to him. Her mother quietly forced her to take pills, as she did for Leanne's 2 older sisters, and Leanne and her boyfriend made love when they could find the time and place to do so, at least every week. She found that she loved making love, obviously much more than girls usually do, at least according to the magazines she read. But after 6 months of sleeping only with Bradley, she became increasingly curious about other boys, and the temptation to try one of them became stronger. Only a strong sense of devotion and loyalty to the boy she was sure she would marry kept her from temptation. But I'll tell you, she said, it certainly didn't stop me from fantasizing. In my senior year, there were about 6 boys and several teachers with whom I dreamed of making love. Sometimes at night I would satisfy myself by imagining doing it with one of them, and it was much more exciting than when I fantasized about Bradley. When Leanne went to college at the University of Minnesota and Bradley went to Grinnell College in Iowa, it took no more than 2 months before their long-distance romance broke up. He met someone else. So much for the man she was going to marry. Leanne was unhappy and hurt, but only for a few days. Then she began to realize that the cute guys from Minnesota who were constantly flirting with her in the dorm or in the cafeteria were no longer out of her reach. I've decided that I don't need another guy, at least for a while. All the time I was with Bradley, I had fantasies about different guys, and now is my chance. So Leanne succumbed to the temptation of casual lovemaking, meeting several different men at the same time and making love to almost all of them. often on the first or second date. It was exciting to get such attention from men, and for a few weeks she enjoyed it. But she soon discovered that her behavior was causing problems. Firstly, all these parties prevented me from studying, and in the first semester I almost failed 2 courses. Secondly, I slept with 3 different guys in the dorm, and rumors began to spread that I was weak on the front. All sorts of jerks came up to me and made rude remarks, or even tried to flirt. And then the guy I met at the bar and was ready to go to bed with turned out to be pretty rude. A girl from my history class saw me with him and dragged me into the ladies' room. She said that her roommate dated him last year, and he beat her half to death while making love. So she ended up in intensive care with bruises on her face and 2 broken ribs. Well, it scared the hell out of me. I slipped out of the bar through the back door to get away from this guy, went back to the dorm, and decided to make some changes. I was very impressed by Leanne's story about how she took control of the situation, carefully considering what she wanted and how to get it, while maintaining her own safety. First, she reduced the number of dates to 2 or 3 a week so as not to be distracted from her studies. Secondly, she decided not to have sex with anyone in the dorm or in class. It was easy enough to meet men on a large campus, and it was much safer for her reputation if it wasn't those who saw her every day or knew all her friends. Thirdly, she enrolled in a women's self-defense course offered by the Department of Physical Education. She had attended this course for 3 semesters and had mastered the maneuvers necessary for self-defense in case of rough treatment from a guy, which happened once or twice. Finally, after watching a scary movie about sexually transmitted diseases at a dormitory meeting, she vowed to always use rubber bands from now on, without exception. For the rest of her studies in Minnesota, Leanne was a successful student, an active participant in sorority, had many girlfriends, but at the same time made love to a number of men, usually no more than once or twice with each. Sometimes her friends teased her that she didn't have a boyfriend, or wondered out loud why the cute guys they sometimes saw her with never showed up a second time. But she was very careful to hide the details of her bed life. She almost always made love to the men she met in their rooms or apartments, ideally at some distance from her own dorm. Sometimes the back seat of a car turned out to be the right place, and some of her lovers even rented a motel room. Leanne told me about all this with excited pleasure, but not without some wariness. She understood all too well what society thinks of a woman behaving in this way, even though a man doing the same is considered a stud or a gambler. Tom, I liked what I did. I don't regret it, and I'm not going to apologize for it. Okay? You have nothing to apologize for, Leanne, I said. I believe that adults by mutual consent can make love as much as they want, with whom they want, in any way they want, provided that everyone agrees. Our culture does not approve of certain behaviors of women, but this is a problem of our culture. She looked pleased with my answer, but I could see that she didn't quite believe me. In her senior year, Leanne fell in love with a young lecturer at the sociology department where she studied. She took 2 of his courses, and he took a special interest in her, praised her academic work, and urged her to write a thesis. He never violated the rules of student-teacher relations, but when his sophomore year ended, he invited her to dinner. Looking back, it was crazy for me to marry him, she said. Adam was older, he was 28, sophisticated, brilliant. I was incredibly flattered that he needed me not only because of my body. He thought I was very smart and talented, which just blew me away. We didn't even make love for the first 2 months, although I would have jumped into bed with him at the first request. But he didn't suit me, and as soon as the infatuation passed, I was able to look at him sensibly. Adam was a quiet, self-absorbed loner. In many ways, he is a typical scientist. But no matter how smart he is, he bores the hell out of me. I didn't want to go dancing, skiing, or even have a picnic in the park or go to the movies. He wanted to work in the library or read at home in his office. And he wanted me to cook dinner for him, kiss him on the cheek, and not disturb him until it was time to make love, after which he would turn away and fall asleep. And he didn't want to make love that often, maybe twice a week, which wasn't enough for me. Needless to say, the marriage did not last long. Leanne divorced Adam, amicably enough, after a year or 2 and moved to Chicago. She tracked down the father of one of her sorority sisters and got a job at his real estate office, while she studied in the evenings to get her own real estate license. After obtaining a license, she began selling houses, which she still successfully does, working for 2 different companies, and about a year before meeting Mark, she joined the Century 21 franchise. And of course, as soon as she got rid of Adam, she returned to an active bed life. After a year or two, I was already making good money and found myself a great one-bedroom apartment in the city center, a mile or so from the lake. And she went a little crazy. There are so many wonderful men in Chicago. She looked at me defiantly, as if she expected me to criticize her. When I smiled at her silently, she continued, "I know how it sounds, damn it, but I love men." Again the defiant look, and again no reaction on my part. She was looking at me, as if urging me to stop her or feel awkward. The difference in skill level is also amazing. God knows, I've had enough frustrating satisfactions with guys who didn't have the slightest idea about women. But there are men who just turn me inside out, knowing what to do and when to do it. Mark is the same, she said thoughtfully. Of course, he's not the biggest one I've ever had. He doesn't make love all night long. But he's so attentive and responsive to me, and he always wants to please me so much. He makes me feel so wanted and so loved. Her voice trailed off for a moment, and she looked towards the window before returning to our conversation. I like to feel how a new guy smells, what he likes in bed. Surprisingly, almost every guy thinks that the first time should be in a missionary position. But when I ask a guy how he would like to try again, he almost always has a favorite pose. Leanne continued in the same vein for quite a long time, with enthusiastic details. I think part of her kept trying to challenge me, shock me, or get me to call her a woman of easy virtue. But I also realized that because she was so secretive about her bed life, even with her close friends, she never had anyone with whom she could talk openly about it. And when she was allowed to talk about everything, it was a relief. I had many ways to prevent a relationship with one man from becoming too personal, or that I would lose my privacy. I didn't date anyone from work or anyone I knew socially. In fact, when I met guys, for example, in a bar or somewhere else, I was always called Marie. She never gave her phone number, just took their number if she was interested. And she never brought guys to her apartment. We always did it at their house or at the hotel. After a moment's hesitation, she looked at me again, expecting my condemnation. "I assure you, Leanne," I said, "you don't need to apologize for all this. Being beautiful is not a bad thing, but knowing what you like is good. You are honest with yourself about your attractiveness, and it seems that you are just as honest with the men you make love to." She relaxed slightly, as if she was beginning to believe that I really wasn't judging her. "So you were quite happy with this lifestyle? And then you met Mark?" "Yes, that's right. It happened a couple of weeks after my 20th birthday. I was selling houses that his company was building, and we met at the construction site when I was shown the facilities. I wasn't looking for a husband or a serious relationship. I was quite happy with my life. I liked my job, I had some good friends, and I received a lot of love. When I first met Mark, well, you saw him. He's one of the most handsome men I've ever met, so of course I was attracted to him. And I realized that he had noticed me, although during the tour he only smiled and made a few polite remarks. Then, when I was about to leave, he walked me to my car and asked if he could treat me to something in the evening. At first, I was in great doubt because I have a no men from work rule, and because he already knows me as Leanne. But he was such a charming guy, and looked so good that I made an exception. I told myself that we could meet casually at work, but we wouldn't work together regularly, so it wouldn't be a problem. We met the next evening. At first, all I thought about was getting into bed with him. I fantasized about him, about that beautiful face and athletic body. But when we were sitting and talking, I was distracted from my lustful feelings all the time. He was so cool and so interesting. He told funny jokes, but he also listened to me. It seemed to me that no one had ever listened to me so attentively when I was talking. Except maybe Adam, when he first tried to make me fall in love with him. But it passed quickly for him. She snorted derisively. But with Mark, he's definitely not a wimp, but he was so sweet, polite, and attentive. It almost didn't go with the fact that he was so handsome. Usually such attractive guys are also arrogant assholes. It's good to sleep with them once or twice, but you don't want to spend extra time with them. We sat for a long time over drinks. When we finally got ready to leave the bar, I hoped that he would invite me to his place. I was more than ready to make love to him. But instead, he took my hand and asked if I would come to him on Friday, so that he could cook dinner for us. "I'm actually a pretty good cook," he said with a very sweet smile. And that Friday night in his apartment changed everything. I went there still thinking of him as a really hot guy. Well, cute too, but mostly hot, who I'd like to sleep with. But by the next morning, I was already half in love with him. Mark is so gentle, so attentive, but also a man. And a spark passed between us. Not just attraction. I'm used to such feelings. But some kind of crazy feeling that we belong to each other. It scared me a little bit, because a serious relationship was the last thing I was interested in. My previous relationships didn't work out too well, and I was happy dating a lot of guys, keeping my ease and distance. But Mark easily overcame all my barriers. Making love was incredible, but that's not why he hooked me so much. He treated me like the most beautiful creature in the world. I was the center of his attention every minute, and he seemed to love every part of me. He touched me, stroked me, told me how beautiful I was, how incredibly pleasant it was to touch me. And then suddenly everything became different. Hard and fast, slightly rough. Taking my legs on his shoulders, he just crashed into me. Leanne's account of their love affair was much like Mark's. They enjoyed everything they did together, from the romantic to the mundane. She loved just sitting on the couch in his living room in the evenings, wearing nothing but one of his button-down shirts, watching TV and holding his hand. After a couple of weeks, I realized that I wanted to be with him forever. And that, of course, scared the hell out of me, given my track record. Would I really be able to refuse to meet other men? I decided I had to. So I haven't met any guys for almost 2 months. And then one day at Starbucks, a 40-year-old guy with a gorgeous mustache accidentally spilled coffee on my skirt. He was so sweet and so apologetic, and insisted on paying for the dry cleaning. Anyway, I got his phone number, met him the next night, and we slept at his apartment. He was really very good, and it was very pleasant. But after I left, I felt incredibly guilty, as if I had changed the brand. But then I realized that we never promised to be exclusive with each other, and it didn't change my feelings about Mark one bit. I still loved him, and still wanted to be with him. So I decided that there would be a place for both of them in my life, if only I would keep them completely separate. And the next evening, when I saw Mark and we made love, everything was as beautiful as before. So, it seemed to me that everything was fine. I just had an affair with Mark in one box, and a casual bed life in another. I still used rubber bands with all my men, but one day I asked Mark if we could both take a test, and then I would take pills, and we could do without rubber bands. It was a kind of commitment that I was more than willing to make. I've been taking pills for a few years now, just in case, but I didn't tell Mark about it. When Mark asked Leanne to move in together, she was a little scared. It sounded like marriage to her, and remembering Adam and the horrors of boring monogamy, she told Mark that she wasn't ready for it yet. Therefore, the proposal made to her a few months later took her by surprise. I was all emotional, because I felt that everything suddenly fell into place, and I was not ready for this. I burst into tears, we went back to my apartment, made love, and I just snuggled up to him. I felt so in love and was so desperate, but I realized that I had to tell him the truth, that I was sleeping with other guys, and that I wanted to keep doing it. It scared me to death, but I wasn't ready to lie to him or marry him by cheating. Have you ever thought about giving up intimacy with other men? Of course I did, Tom, she snapped. How selfish do you take me for? I waited in silence, and then she sighed. I'm sorry. It's a perfectly reasonable question. Yes, I've been thinking about it for weeks, and I had to think about it more when Mark proposed to me. I knew that I loved him as I had never loved anyone, much more than I loved Adam, but I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to stay faithful. I endured a monogamous life with Adam for almost 2 years, and it almost drove me crazy. And the only thing that gave me courage was that I only asked to continue what we were already doing. Mark didn't know this, but I dated other guys, and it didn't hurt our relationship at all. If I could make him understand that, then maybe we could work things out. What happened next, according to Leanne's version, was almost the same as in Mark's story. She told him emotionally and lovingly that she wanted to continue dating other men. Mark recoiled from her in shock, but slowly, gradually, she was able to assure him of her love. A few more months later, without haste, their romance resumed with the same intensity. And a few months after that, He proposed again, and they got married. Leanne, may I ask you how do you make your relationships with other men completely separate from your life with Mark? It's probably not that easy. Well, she said, it was much easier before we started living together, when we were just dating. But it's not that hard either, unless I'm counting on Mark not going through my purse. I always have elastic bands and a spare set of panties with me in case something interesting happens to someone and my panties get wet before I can take them off. I always have shampoo, toothbrush, and toothpaste with me. Every day before returning home, I brush my teeth, regardless of whether I was with someone or not. So Mark is already used to this taste, and it does not arouse his suspicions. I always take a shower and clean up after intimacy before coming home, so I don't have to rush into the house and take a shower before Mark hugs me. And, as I said, the guys I date know me as Marie, and they don't have my phone number. I always call them myself. Did your meetings with other men ever interfere with your bed life with Mark? Mostly, no. As I said before, I'm never with another man except during the day when my husband is at work or on a trip. I don't go to the bar in the evenings or anything like that. And since men always use rubber bands, I don't have to worry about being covered in liquid. Many times I made love to Mark on the same evening when I was with someone in the afternoon, and it's really exciting. This makes making love to him even more heated, because just a few hours earlier I had already been satisfied. With a slightly embarrassed look, she said, "Can you tell us about the day when Mark came home earlier?" I asked. She grimaced. I don't usually bring men into the house, honestly. It was only the second time in my life. His name is Theo. I met him 3 or 4 years ago. He was a waiter at a downtown restaurant where I had lunch with a couple of friends, and he was incredibly attentive to us. And very mill. Actually, he was only 22 or so at the time. He provided us with the most attentive service we have ever seen. Something about him attracted me. When my friends and I were leaving, I said I had to go back and go to the bathroom, and they all left. I found Theo outside the bar. He smiled broadly at me, but looked a little surprised that I was back. I went up to him and said softly, "You've served us very well, Theo, and I was wondering if I could return the favor." I put my hand on his and squeezed lightly. Nothing superfluous, but he understood. I asked him for his phone number, and he gave it to me as soon as he could. I called him the next day, under the name Marie, of course, and we agreed to meet in the afternoon at his apartment. It turned out that he usually worked in the evenings at the restaurant, and he did not have to return until 5 in the evening. I saw him probably 4 more times before I stopped calling him. It was great every time, but I never let a relationship with a guy last too long. You never know when he's going to start thinking he's in love with you, or try to track you down or something. Anyway, that day I literally came face to face with him. I was leaving the Century 21 office, returning the keys to the apartment I was showing, and he was just heading to the office. He was moving to Philadelphia and was just handing over the keys to the apartment he was renting. We went for a cup of coffee, and I thought, I have the afternoon off, he's leaving, Mark is in Milwaukee. What's wrong with using my house at least once? I told him that I have a vacant house for Century 21, which is not yet for sale, and we can use the backyard on this day until 4 p.m. or so. Then I gave him instructions, and he drove later to meet me, around 12:30. I went home to take a shower and change into a real tight bikini with a thong, which I wear exclusively for Mark when no one is around. When Theo saw this, his eyes practically popped out on his forehead. I couldn't think of anything else to do but wait for him to come home. And when he came into the house at 6 o'clock, I could see from his face that he was very upset. I knew that he either saw or heard me with Theo, or in some other way guessed that I was with a man. He walked past me, wouldn't let me hug him, and locked himself in the bedroom. Their dinner and the next few days and nights were incredibly difficult. Leanne confirmed what Mark had told me. He stubbornly refused to discuss any aspects of that day. Her account of what had been in their relationship since that day was practically the same as Mark's. How it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to maintain an erection. How their romantic journey turned into a painful disaster. How he began to avoid her at night, going to bed very late or laying down in the guest room. I've really tried everything I can think of, Tom. I was as loving as possible and patient and always ready for intimacy. But he doesn't come up to me anymore, and he doesn't talk to me, despite all my efforts. Leanne knows that Mark saw her with Theo that day, but does not know what exactly he saw and what bothers him about it. Is it just that he's finally faced with something he's been so diligently ignoring? Or that she and Theo were in the backyard of their house with Mark? Is there something in the very proximity that upsets him? Leanne has no idea, and I can't tell her. Mark will have to do it.